In this video, we're going to talk about types of research sort of broadly, because these ideas and these classifications can be somewhat challenging for students, so we're sort of going to dig into that. So we're going to talk about exploratory research, descriptive research, explanatory research, evaluation research, and empowerment research. There are other ways of classifying research. This is just the ones that your book is using, so that's the ones that we're using in this class. So if you've seen other labels, don't necessarily worry about like, well, is that this? Because there are other ways of classifying it. So if we're talking about an individual piece of research, we might classify it as exploratory and inductive and qualitative and a number of different things. So these are sort of terms that you need to understand, but don't necessarily worry about how they relate to other ones. So exploratory research is the conversation for what? And it's we don't really know much about this at all. So we kind of need to like dig in and just see what's there. Generally speaking, exploratory research is pretty qualitative in nature, just because otherwise you can't ask questions like what's going on here of statistics easily. It's possible, but it's hard, but it's difficult to do. So exploratory research is really the place where sociologists start when they're interested in something that very few other people have been interested in before. And I'll sort of talk about an example of that from my own research to sort of give you a concrete sort of space. One of the things that I do is I talk about how faculty make sense of assigning grades to undergraduate students, which I would have thought was a very simple thing, but it isn't because no one has asked that question before. So I am doing a piece of work that is relatively limited, right? It's faculty in a single discipline at a very small number of institutions, not because I only care about that discipline or those institutions, but because when you're doing exploratory research, you generally wind up with that sort of environment because there's for example, there's nothing I can do in that to test, right? I can't test so-and-so's conclusion because no one wrote that conclusion, so I have to sort of work from that perspective at the sort of outset. So that's exploratory research. Descriptive research is, roughly speaking, about how much. And that is, for example, once I finish this project about how faculty assign grades to undergraduate students, the process that I'm in right now is suggesting that there's going to be a number of different approaches. I think we're coming down around 5 or 6. Number doesn't matter. But in that exploratory research, I can identify like 5 different ways of doing that. And then when you get to descriptive research, you're asking a slightly different question. You're asking, for example, how common are those 5 approaches across a discipline, across an institution, across a field, if that's sort of what you want to do. So when you're talking about descriptive research, you want to know how many people are affected, how important this is in sort of people's lives, right? There's a lot of sort of questions that are about just sort of like understanding it. You can't really do descriptive research without a sort of background in exploratory research. And that's sort of an introduction to say that all of these types of research are related. You can't, like, it's not that one is better than the other, it's that you can't do some of them without other ones, and it's a question of what question you're asking, what things you were interested in when you do that piece. So they all have their value in that sort of space. So that's the descriptive research part. It's like, what is actually out there? So for example, this might include the kinds of studies in higher education talking about, hey, what is the proportion of female students in what disciplines, in what fields, how well are they doing, that kind of thing, okay? So that's that sort of descriptive piece. The next one that I'm going to sort of dig into is this idea of explanatory research. And explanatory research is really where you start asking the why question. So you have this exploratory or descriptive research that says something is happening. So for example, if we're going to follow up that sort of gender and discipline question, you have data that says there are fewer women engineers than there are, like, women are underrepresented in engineering faculties. That's a statement. And that is sort of shown in your descriptive research. When you move into an explanatory project, you'd be asking why. So you're looking for what changes that, whether that's, and you might come up with any number of different answers there. You might sort of come into almost all of the engineering faculty are male, and so they pay more attention to male students in classes, right? And that's an answer that might come up if what you're seeing is women start engineering but don't finish it. And if you see that they're just not starting, then you might go into different explanations. So you might look, for example, at math and science teachers in high schools and how they're shaping those expectations. You might talk about expectations and ideas about how students perceive engineering. And if they perceive engineering to be a really demanding career that requires a lot of long hours, then maybe women won't be pursuing it because they perceive that their family commitments are more important. Like, there are lots of different reasons that you could look at. So we spend a lot of time doing explanatory research because at some point, like, we figure out that all of these answers are possible, and then you do further explanatory research that's really about, well, which of these answers is more important, like it has a larger effect, and sort of all of that is that sort of why question, okay? Evaluation research is usually something that follows explanatory research with sort of an intermediary step. So often, sociologists are interested in making the world better. What better means kind of not important right now, but that's the idea. That sociologists are interested in making the world better, along with many activists and many other people in society. And so when we get these explanatory responses, this explanatory research that says, women are not entering or graduating engineering programs for these reasons, A, B, C, D, okay? Often people are going to try to create interventions to address A, B, C, and D, right? So they might talk about offering different training to high school teachers. They might talk about ensuring, like, training faculty at the university level to do things. They might talk about PR campaigns to talk about, and allowing engineering firms to talk about work-life balance, like whatever that is. There's a lot of different options. They're creating an intervention to try to fix this problem. Evaluation research is the one that asks the question, does that work? So they're looking at sort of a pre-post design and sort of saying, are people's perceptions changing? Are the outcomes changing? All of that sort of stuff. So that's sort of evaluation research, and it's really about, are you going about this the right way? It is sociological research because often when we look at that kind of intervention, that kind of programming, we can get a sense of, okay, well, that part worked, but this part didn't, and it worked for these reasons, and that allows us to sort of move into other interventions to sort of like use what we've learned beforehand. Okay. The last type of research that I'm going to talk about is sort of empowerment research, and empowerment research is like evaluation research, but it kind of exists in like this middle ground, right? In that it is part intervention and part evaluation research. So it's part, this is the action we're trying to take to correct the problem, and research about whether or not we are fixing the problem at the same time. And this is something that is used really, really commonly when you're dealing with problems and situations and issues that disproportionately affect groups that are already marginalized. So, for example, a really, really very, very sort of contemporary example in Canada, and this is sort of discussed in your book a little bit, is research on Indigenous people, and sort of research that touches on issues, for example, in reserve communities. And Indigenous people in Canada have a very long history of being marginalized and sort of oppressed in a variety of different ways. And part of that is that there's been a lot of research done on Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples in this country, and much less research done with Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. So when you're talking about empowerment research, that often means a researcher who is going into a community and saying, what is the problem we need to understand? What is the action we need to take to fix it? And really embracing the relationship with that community, and to teach and to sort of empower or allow members of the community, and members of, again, a particular, often marginalized groups, but to allow the people that they are interested in understanding to develop a better sense of agency and a better sense of their own ability to change their outcomes. So when we talk about the outcomes of empowerment research, it often includes both sort of changes to material environments. So did you improve test scores? But it also includes a sort of piece about, did the community members you work with develop an increased sense of how they might go about making changes in their communities? Do they feel better able to get the results that they want, even if they haven't gotten them yet? So that kind of idea of empowerment research it's often very time consuming. It takes a long time to do empowerment research, participatory action research, because of that community engagement. But a lot of sociologists do it because they're also convinced that it's really, really important in terms of sort of longer term effects in terms of community. Because if you empower the people who are experiencing marginalization to understand and define their own problems and then to define their own solutions, then you're going to have solutions that meet their needs more appropriately rather than sort of being imposed top down. Okay, so that's empowerment research. As I said, this is only one way of classifying research. There is others.